So thanks, Josh, very much for meeting with us. I'll give a little bit of an introduction and background. I must say I'm still only less than a month into this project. Andreas has been on this for a while, but yeah, the context is we're working with a hospital in South Africa. It's a public hospital, so funded by the government, very limited resources, a lot of constraints, a lot of difficulties, and we're looking at digitization, specifically in the pediatric surgery department at the moment. And the idea is hopefully it develops into something broader, but we've sort of cut out a little chunk to start. And we, they have a lot of existing systems that we can chat about, but nothing really comprehensive that's working. So attempts at EMR systems that are difficult to use or don't quite give them what they want, and so don't get used. And really, we'd like to build something that's pretty comprehensive, but also very tailored for the kind of unique circumstances there, because they don't have the kind of infrastructure or technology in more developed healthcare systems. They're also constantly on the move, running from building to building, very busy. So there's a lot of need to work with mobile devices and so on. And maybe, yeah, I'll talk about my background. Andreas can talk a little bit more about BSC, I suppose, and how that all started. So I've just finished my PhD at MIT from South Africa originally, and I was lucky enough in my PhD to do work on African healthcare systems. The intention was to optimize the transportation of blood samples in Malawi, but we ended up also needing to build a lot of data systems to figure out where the blood samples were at any given point in time. So I've sort of dipped my toes into that world of trying to implement these systems in very low resource settings where everyone is busy all the time. And really excited to be here. I've spent some time on the ground in South Africa at the hospital that we're working with, understanding their workflows. And that's just been absolutely fascinating. And we're hoping we can at least come up with something that makes their lives easier for now and build it out into something more significant. So Andreas, over to you. What have I missed?
Yeah. Let me do a quick introduction from my side, Josh. So I'm one of the founding directors of BSC. We're a technology and data analytics firm, right? We're based in South Africa. We do have offices kind of around the world, but we're niche. We're 120 professionals worldwide. So we're not like an Accenture where we'll put armies of people in. And we've had an opportunity to we've done work in healthcare, but it's been kind of isolated. Can you guys hear me? Yeah, perfectly. Okay. It's kind of been isolated, and we've had an opportunity now to do something more substantive through this particular project. It's a case where we have an opportunity now to do something quite unique, simply from the perspective that the level of bureaucracy is low. The level of entrepreneurialism, can-do type attitude is very high, and so we have an opportunity to do something substantive here, starting small and then growing. The work was initiated by someone who's involved in philanthropy and is raising funding to fund a broader scale project. So that's important. But yeah, as Emma said, we're starting off in pediatric surgery. Now, I think one other important thing is we aren't experts in healthcare, right? So whilst analytics, technology implementations, and so on is something that's pretty cool. We've been doing that for 20 plus years, and we've done some healthcare projects, more in the analytics space. We're not healthcare experts, and when we embarked upon the route to saying, well, can we really help here, we got very despondent. For the very reasons that you initiated the creation of FHIR, right? We saw a very old state type mentality of monolithic systems, very expensive, a very kind of mindset of we'll implement the system and you have to adapt to our processes, to how the system does things. And it was just like, no way and we certainly weren't going to start something from scratch. So we were about to say no to this project or this opportunity, because it's more than a project, until we came across FHIR And even more so until we came across the open source implementations and what's been done in the cloud in terms of what you guys have done in AWS and GCP. So that opened up the avenue to say, hang on a sec, there's light at the end of the tunnel here. We can use an established, secure, scalable, cloud-first backend that's cost-effective and just focus on the part that matters, which is building the front-end side that honors the users and the clinicians' workflows, right? And so that got very exciting. And then, as Emma said, we then spent quite a bit of time, and especially Emma, shadowing the clinicians, understanding their workflows. So we have a very, very good understanding and good relationship. So there's fertile ground here to do something quite amazing, actually. So we're very excited about it, and even more so that we have an opportunity to talk to you to see how we can avoid pitfalls and fast track the process and also contribute back, right? The extent to which we can use this as a way of contributing back. I think and I'll use the word, I think it's criminal that an open standards approach is not prolific in the healthcare space, right? And I think it's criminal that you speak to people that should be in the know and they haven't even heard of FHIR, right? And it's not like because they are pursuing an alternative. And the extent to which we can contribute back to further that cause is something worthwhile, and we need to understand how we can contribute back.
Great. This is, super helpful context for me. A little bit about myself. So I got involved in this space really as a medical student. I had studied computer science before medical school, thought I wanted to go into clinical practice. And then while I was rotating through a number of hospitals in the Boston area, I saw they were just starting to put electronic health record systems into place. And it was just too difficult to pull out and make sense of the data that should be informing care and clinical decision making. And I got very involved in that domain. Wound up building some integrations kind of by hand and realizing just how hard that was to do and to maintain. And then got involved in this domain of interoperability from the academic perspective. I joined a research project at Boston Children's Hospital, which was the Smart Health IT project, and I joined the research faculty there and at the Harvard Department of Biomedical Informatics, and got very involved in some of the early work that was happening in the FHIR community because we had some real shared interests. And over the years, I've gotten more involved with Health Level 7, which is the standards organization that publishes FHIR. I moved over from the academic world where I still have an appointment, but my day job now is at Microsoft, where I'm the architect for healthcare. And generally, I'm focused on building infrastructure, building standards, building developer tools and documentation that can help anyone to implement support for healthcare data, whether that's in Microsoft's cloud or somewhere else. So my focus is really industry-wide. What are the places where we need better standards, and what are the places where more documentation or more tutorials, educational material could help? So that's kind of a little bit about me and my interests. I've done some work in clinical data modeling, some work in security and authorization. I run a very small team. There's 3 of us at Microsoft who are kind of focused in this space working with me. And we tend to gravitate towards projects that are either consumer facing or unlocking data for consumers to use. Not necessarily because that's the very most important unsolved problem in healthcare, but at least in my estimation, it's the problem that gets the least organizational attention. It tends not to be that high up on the list of priorities for clinical providers and for some EHR vendors. And so I've found that to be a place where even a small amount of improvement can lead to outsized benefit. So that tends to be where my team focuses. But I've also done some work on clinical decision support and other kind of clinician-facing infrastructure, as well as patient access.
Yeah. And whilst it's not our focus right now, we're very excited around the CDS and the hooks that are in there, because in my mind, it's just such a no-brainer to bring this agile type data science approach to bear for clinical decision making in the at the point of care. And the fact that the plumbing has been created for that, and we can just start getting smart data scientists to plug into that in collaboration with clinicians, I think opens up a new avenue of rapid evolution of the CDS approach. So yeah.
So I'm not exactly sure where's the best place to start, but I'll say, from your perspective, thinking about light at the end of the tunnel here and thinking about open standards that everyone can benefit from, I love that orientation. It's very much in line with the way that I'm thinking about this space. I'm also maybe a bit of a natural pessimist as well. So, there's dark corners still, to be sure. And I'll say, maybe to put this in a positive light, one of the reasons that this technology has been taking off pretty well in the US and in a few other places has been specific national or regional investments in what I'll call data profiling. So as you start to dig into the FHIR standards, you'll see that it's kind of a scaffold. It's a framework by which you can build all kinds of healthcare workflows, all kinds of healthcare data structures, but it's pretty abstract. It doesn't get down to the level of specific coding systems for the most part. It doesn't assume any particular clinical workflow. And so often people will look at this as a set of building blocks. So in the context of the US, we have a set of national profiles that lock down these kinds of details. And those profiles get into a fair level of specificity. They'll say things like, if you're recording somebody's, well, first of all, we have rules nationally that say you have to be able to represent these classes of data in a standard way and expose them from your EHR system. That's kind of built into the way that EHRs are sold and marketed in the US. So no matter who makes it, no matter how the EHR is designed, if it's going to be a certified system, and that gets invoked in many of the regulatory incentive programs. If it's going to be certified, it needs to have these certain capabilities, like exposing a core data set. And so that sets a baseline. So we all know, okay, no matter how this electronic health record system is organized internally, it's going to surface medications and problems and allergies and vital signs and so on in a standard way. And then we get into details in our national profiles about exactly which codes or value sets need to be used. So we'll say things like medication lists in the US need to be exposed with RX norm, and problem list items need to have something like a SNOMED code. We'll get down to that level of detail. And then we'll also point to specific areas of the FHIR specification where there might be optional elements. And we'll say things like, well, in the context of sharing a clinical summary in the US, this optional element is actually required. So something like a patient name or medical record number. In general, FHIR doesn't want to assume that all patient data will be identified, so there might be no name in a FHIR payload. But for the US common data set or core data set, we say the profile is going to ratchet that up to impose additional constraints to make sure we know we can rely on certain data elements. And then we will also find data elements that might be missing from the core FHIR specifications, but still important in our context of use, and we'll define extensions for them that every certified product would need to support. So in the US, we have standardized extensions for things like a patient's birth sex and race and ethnicity, because those tie into some of the national reporting programs. So that would be an example of somewhere that the initial FHIR specification is just sort of silent or leaves it open for downstream extension. And so that's a major investment in the context of US healthcare, where we will spell out those details about what we need from the systems, and then we'll produce these kinds of detailed computable expectations about how they should look so that we can test the EHRs. We can test these systems and make sure they're behaving consistently. That's all just a little bit of background to say these are the kinds of decisions that anyone working with FHIR will need to make. It's best if those decisions can reflect local consensus or even a broader consensus. National level consensus would be great in a lot of places, but the work needs to happen somewhere. And so just looking at the core FHIR specification, there's going to be some additional work to do in terms of building out those profiles.
Yeah. Josh, so that we have some very practical questions to ask you about the profiles, because we've been obviously schooling up on FHIR at various levels, including getting the Azure FHIR service up and running and so on. So and so we have some questions around the profiles, because obviously we've established that the power and the value of FHIR is that it is highly it's generalized, it's highly extensible, it's not prescriptive about what vocabulary you use. So that's an advantage. It also, though, puts the onus on getting agreement and consensus on developing those profiles and so on. And so we have questions around that. What might be useful to get a view from you on, which is hard for us to establish, is what is the prevalence of the adoption of FHIR overall. And what I'm finding frustrating is, when you're Googling, a whole bunch of stuff shows up from 2018, 17, 19, but nothing, not nothing, less so for the last 4 years. And obviously we've seen that you're very active recently, like in the last year or two, with your YouTube stuff and that been looking at the Git commits. But it almost seems like there was a peak and then a lot of momentum lost. Is that incorrect? Is it just the wrong perception?
Yeah, I think that's a misperception. I'm trying to think about data sources that might tell that story or might tell a different story in a sort of quantitative or analytical way. One thing we can look at.
But let's just say you go to the app gallery, the Smart on FHIR app gallery, right?
Okay. So the Smart on FHIR app gallery is an area where a research project funded at Boston Children's Hospital has put together free and open resources where anyone can list apps that they've built. I think this was a particularly important kind of anchoring point early on in the narrative about where these apps can come from and how they can be deployed. These days, in the context of US healthcare, every certified system needs to support these apps natively. So we talked about the FHIR standards and exposing data, but they also need to support integration of smart apps into the EHR. And that includes clinician-facing use cases where these apps run at the point of care. And it includes patient-facing use cases where an individual can install an app of their choice on their phone. So you'll get to talk to JP from the Commons Foundation either later this week or next week. They have an example of an app like that, which is a patient-facing app on Android. There's a similar kind of general purpose health record management app on iOS. And those are all in the camp of patient can pick the app. The provider doesn't really even need to know about or approve those apps. It's just something the patient can use to aggregate and manage their own records. All of this is to say, in our context of use, these are now native capabilities of the EHRs. And so if you're a clinician looking to see what are the apps that you might want to install inside of your Epic-based EHR system, you can go to the Epic website and browse them directly and install them directly. And if you're looking to install something in context of your Cerner health system or Athena health system, you can go to that vendor gallery or store and browse things directly. So I think there's been less of a direct need for kind of this aggregated view. One of the things that we were constantly chasing was metadata about which systems has this app been installed in. So we've seen most app developers have been focused on just building those relationships directly with the EHRs rather than kind of publishing them off to the side in this open way. So that's part of the story there for the Smart App Gallery in particular. But if we look at the overall kind of adoption rate in the community, both internationally with FHIR and in the US context, around smart app adoption, I think the signals are speaking to this ramping up. In the US, that's largely led by regulations. So the regulations were published in 2020, and they begin to take effect by the end of this year in terms of the requirements for certified EHRs. So we've seen something like 50 certified EHRs who have demonstrated this capability to date, and it's going to be a mad scramble at the testing labs between now and the end of the year for others to get that certification. I was at the community event last week, the FHIR Connectathon, where I was participating in a track along with the folks who manage that certification program. And they indeed said that their slots had pretty much filled up for this year. So that's sort of one way to get a sense of adoption. Some of the other metrics that we can use are reference servers. So there are some open FHIR servers that the community leans on in order to try out FHIR and sort of learn how it works. And the access logs from those servers certainly tell a story of global use and tell a story of expanded use. Similar story in the FHIR chat. So that the community chat, which if you haven't seen it yet, is chat.phir.org. It's just an amazing resource. And if you look at, there's a public set of statistics associated with that server. You can see sort of total user growth has been on this trajectory, looking back kind of as far as the logs go. So I think there's a pretty strong story of sustained growth here. That said, I don't doubt that as a community, we are setting ourselves up for what might look like kind of a classic Gartner hype curve effect. I think we're still very much at the point where the industry is looking at FHIR as that light at the end of the tunnel, as a solution, and I think it will be. But there's also going to be bumps along this road where organizations kind of hit this wall of having to understand all the things that FHIR doesn't provide out of the box, or all of the details of negotiating agreements with trading partners that still exist even in this brave new world.
Perfect. Okay. Well, that's the answer I was hoping for, the response I was hoping for. So it's that's very encouraging and great to hear. Because yeah, my perception was purely anecdotal from just Google searches. If I may ask you, Josh, on this, so you mentioned about certified EHRs, etc. Is there any fundamental reason, technically or otherwise, why one cannot use the FHIR app service, the Azure FHIR service, as an EMR backend?
There's no fundamental reason, but there are many details to unpack. Sure. In the context of the U.S. certification program, there are many requirements, and they span everything from the way that an electronic health record vendor manages its user acceptance testing programs, and kind of the internal development process, spanning to communication channels with public health, which often use standards, but earlier standards, so things like HL7 version 2 messaging. There's requirements for surfacing data using still other standards like the clinical document architecture, in addition to these FHIR API requirements. So from a standards lens, there's many flavors of standards that these vendors need to support. And then from a functionality perspective, there's all kinds of functionality that is independent of standards, but things like supporting an electronic prescribing workflow, things like supporting a workflow for reconciling a patient's at-home medication list with a hospital medication list, and
right.
on and on down the line, to the point where data storage is really one small piece of that story, building up the levels of user experience, access control, authorization, building up specific clinical workflows, integrating decision support, all of that winds up kind of dominating the picture in terms of the total level of effort. So I would say that, yeah, I think we are starting to see new vendors who are, as they come into this space, are looking at things like the FHIR API as the data backend. And I think that's a very sensible place to start if you're building a new product. But it's a very small part of the overall work of building a new product. Sure. Even to the point where I would say you could probably swap it out with your own thing, and the sort of total cost of that move early on would be relatively small.
Yeah. Okay, makes sense. Okay, yeah, but it also depends how far you're going in terms of a full-on EHR product, right? Like
yes, no. So if you don't need to build a full EHR product, and you're focused on sort of a narrow slice of the workflow, and you've got enough data connections and enough sort of UX touch points that you don't need to worry too much about the details of handoffs back and forth, because let's say your audience is just going to be pediatricians in surgery, and they've got a dedicated mobile app that they're just going to run, right? Like maybe all you really need is scheduling integration and integration with the operating theater infrastructures to know what case is happening in which OR, and then just generic clinical data access from an underlying system. If your touch points are small in that way, yeah, you could for sure. I tend to think about that as kind of building an app. I don't think there's a bright line here, but it's a small slice of the overall stack, or one puzzle piece. And there, using the FHIR data model as the backend for your application and surfacing just those connections to the EHR that you need, is a very natural thing to do.
Well, you've hit the nail on the head the way you've just described it quite elegantly, which is very. Yeah, the intersection of what you described and where we are is almost 100% on that Venn diagram. And so yeah, that's why we felt very encouraged by the starting point of where we're at with respect to the tool sets that are out there. Because we're not out there to build in a full EHR. We're there to address an immediate need that's very much akin to what you've described. Okay, that is awesome. Then I think in terms of getting started, again, we've been schooling up, got software development, data analytics backgrounds, but clearly it seems to me in terms of developing, well, an ideal solution, just with respect to what you've described, is to use Microsoft Teams and to use the kind of out-of-the-box functionality for scheduling, frontline worker scheduling, et cetera, within Teams would be useful. And then to build a smart FHIR app within Teams, maybe with a messaging chatbot incorporated that handles the touch points around data in and out, right? So that's what we're thinking would be ideal from a front-end perspective. One of the key things is if we're to develop one or more smart FHIR apps here, you want to use a client-side SDK that has your profile built in and makes the developer's job as easy as possible to implement the requisite functionality. Now, what does that process look like? Because I suspect it's like we have to make a choice around profiles. Those profiles, depending on what choices we make, we may or may not have client-side SDKs or libraries that will incorporate those. In your experience, what does that look like? Are you able to offer some light on that?
Sure. I mean, so thinking about building client-side applications, I'll say that I'll even extend this to client and server-side applications. I'll say that today, the libraries that we have tend to be fairly agnostic about profiles, which is to say data profiles, like the fact that, in the context of the US, you're always going to see a patient name. That's not something that most FHIR libraries sort of build in as an assumption. The FHIR spec says, you'll have 0 or more names, and most FHIR libraries just stop there and leave it up to the developer to, build in the logic that says, well, you don't need to deal with this case where there's a missing name. Or similarly for things like medication codes. Most FHIR libraries are pretty much focused on the idea that medications will have a code and leave it up to the developer to know, well, okay, in this context of use, maybe the developer is going to load in the RxNorm database of drug terms next to the FHIR data, and then that developer will know they can always look up terms there in that locally cached copy. And that might lead to the development of an app that makes some assumptions that are locally valid in the US context and would need to be kind of revised for deployment elsewhere. The question of how much of that logic you can and should push into the client library is still, I'll say, something of an open question at the community level. One of the things we've started to see some direct exploration of is making it easy to work with, or easier to work with, FHIR extensions. So the generic FHIR model says that practically any piece of data anywhere in a data structure can have extensions. So almost anything can have an array of extensions associated with it. And each of those extensions has kind of a URL that says, what does this mean? Like, this is the birth sex extension, and then a value. So generically, almost everything can be extended in multiple ways everywhere. And that can make it more difficult to answer questions like, okay, but on this FHIR patient resource, what does the birth sex extension have to say? The code for writing that can be kind of redundant, or it can be boilerplate. It's easy to make mistakes there. So we've started to see some libraries build in functionality like easier accessor functions for specific extensions in a specific domain. So you can have a get patient birth sex kind of method associated with the patient resource that makes sense in the US, and it'll sort of build in the URLs for those extensions so developers don't have to remember them and type them. That's maybe the sort of smallest step that we're seeing happening in that direction. You could obviously go quite a lot further, and some groups are beginning to explore those directions. I'll say my team at Microsoft, particularly a developer, Gino Canessa, has been working on code generation tools that can make that kind of infrastructure easier to do.
Right.
So these are tools that can read in the FHIR spec, read in profiles, and output client library type stuff. And that's a very promising direction. Knowing what you want your client library to look like, though, is still hard. And it can be very easy to build in some nice capabilities, but also accidentally impose limits. And you never want to leave developers downstream kind of stuck. So I think we're still learning what are the right patterns there. I have not seen examples where developers couldn't write a few helper functions for themselves and cover most of the value proposition of a more advanced library. And I don't think that's going to be, I don't think that's a stable projection. I think over time we're going to get a lot better at this stuff, but I wouldn't build in too many expectations or assumptions in the beginning. I would look at this very pragmatically. I would say, let's use the smallest library we can that'll let us show something working, and then we'll learn exactly what we need for our use case, and we can start to build up inside of our application easier ways.
Okay, that's awesome context and advice on that. So yeah, so start off with something basic. Just have a really good developer who's good at abstracting those patterns to build those utility functions sooner rather than later, and yeah, and then go forward from there. Okay.
Yes, and particularly picking up on your theme about places to contribute back to this infrastructure. 2 points on that front. One is just sharing the patterns of the abstractions that you noticed or developed for yourself based on your own needs, just sort of sharing those back with the community and saying, here were some things that we found useful, even just to share at the use case level so that we can take those into consideration when we're building out these kinds of libraries through code generation. And the second is, opportunities to contribute actually servicing libraries. You might wind up building something that could dovetail with some of the standards libraries to layer on some of those abstractions. And those would be, very natural places to think about sharing code back.
Perfect. Yeah, because our goal is to open source anything we do in this regard as well. So that would work well. Are there any particular pointers on which libraries to start with, or we just do the usual things, search around and find something that's got sufficient usage on GitHub?
Yeah, I actually think that's probably better than any recommendation I'm going to make, because my recommendations will be sort of based on the last thing that I used. And I wrote some early versions of a FHIR JavaScript client library, which are now being maintained by the team at Boston Children's Hospital. So those are a good place to look sort of as part of the canvassing. But those are the libraries that I kind of know the best. And there's been more development happening in different places these days, and you might find something that's a better fit kind of for the stack that you're using.
Gotcha. Yeah. I really like the idea of having code generators that take in specs and maybe even take in vocabulary and create very strongly typed libraries. But out of that, but as you point out, that those can have shortfalls, and one should start off practical. Practically, but my kind of engineering side gets drawn to what you've just described there.
Yeah, and that library that I just linked to in the chat, that's the library that Gino Canessa maintains. It's currently used to generate the official FHIR client library, so that's a .NET Stack library. It's also used to generate a more experimental TypeScript library, and it's also used to generate the definitely typed bindings for FHIR. So even if you wind up, building a client-side application that doesn't use a dedicated library at all, there are TypeScript types registered in the definitely typed project, and all that stuff is generated by this tool chain.
That's super useful. Are there any communities you'd suggest that we should be reaching out to?
So I think the connection with JP and the team at the Commons Project is a really good one. If you're not connected with folks from the Open MRS project already, certainly those are folks with a lot of experience doing development and deployment and clinical training across Africa. I went to a presentation at the FHIR Connectathon last week with a couple folks from Open MRS. We had done some early work integrating kind of a precursor to the Smart on FHIR API with OpenMRS back maybe 10 years ago, and they've continued doing development in terms of FHIR support. So that would certainly be a good community to be connected with. I mentioned the FHIR chat just kind of as a general community resource, but there's just amazing global activity and participation there. Even to the point where just sort of asking open-ended questions can be quite revealing. Obviously, pointed questions are the best, but even just trying to understand who's taken an approach like X or Y or Z, folks from around the world will kind of weigh in with what they've tried. So that's a great general purpose resource. In terms of folks who are building smart apps that integrate with surgical management. There's certainly a couple companies that I know in the US who have built apps in that space. I don't know how transferable kind of their knowledge or experience might be, but it could still be kind of an interesting touch point if you're doing some kind of groundwork at this stage. So those are at least a few ideas.
Good. Yeah, that's great. Emma, do you, I've kind of been monopolizing the questions. Do you want to send some your way?
I mean, I think from my side, I'm mostly interested in, how the sort of real-time, hand-in-hand development is going to work. That's our big thing here, to get people to work with us, to use this on the ground. We have to convince them it's not like the other systems that they send an email and like 6 months later they get a response saying, oh, we'll ask someone to look into this now. So I don't know how much experience you have on that side. I mean, boots on the ground, sort of working with clinicians, and what the best sort of way to achieve a balance is there. We want to do something that's useful and that's customized and that's specific, but we don't want to go off on a wild goose chase trying to do things that don't make sense technically, but clinicians think they're a good idea. So I don't know if you've got any anecdotes or light to shed there.
Yeah, I mean, figuring out quite early what boundaries to set can be really important, just to avoid kind of rehashing decisions. And sometimes you need to, but I would be thinking a lot about. Well, so in my terminology here, I'm going to say what you're building is an app, and then like the underlying data management system at the hospital, or the hospital, I'll go and call it EHR, even if those terms don't quite apply. Just sort of squint at it with me for now. I'll say one of the biggest challenges is going to be deciding what level of integration with the EHR you need to support. So for example, if you can get away in your use case without knowing any clinical information from the EHR, and if you can provide something useful in pediatric surgery that is purely focused on communication and administration without needing much or any clinical data, like that's a huge win, because you can eliminate a whole significant source of frustration and challenge. My guess is you probably can't get away with that, but it depends. It might depend on what functionality you're actually building for. And if you can focus conversations with clinical stakeholders in that way early on to say, this is on a roadmap for eventually, but we're starting with, but we're starting by asking the questions of what can we do downstream of that system. There's at least an understanding that these kinds of integrations are hard and take time. So that's sort of at least one concept around expectation setting. I'll say in my experience deploying a couple apps at Boston Children's Hospital, the most challenging and most important thing has been to have clinical stakeholder engagement from very early on, have some kind of clinical champion who wants and is pushing for and kind of shares the vision of what you're building. And that can unlock a lot of doors, or conversely, the absence of that can make it very difficult to get a foothold anywhere. So just understanding who those people are and making sure they're engaged in even some of the earliest design thinking that you do could be quite powerful.
Yeah, but I mean, yeah, that is absolutely crucial. In our case, it's been amazing to spend time with them and see, there are not systems in place, but systems have sort of grown organically out of necessity. We absolutely have to find a way to coordinate as a team, and so people have sort of adopted whatever free tools they can find to do that, and that's super helpful for us in terms of pinpointing exactly what needs to be done first and best. And I guess so. The other question is from a, there's a day-to-day sort of utility and patient care, but ultimately, hopefully, this grows into something that's also very useful from a research perspective. And we are working with clinicians who are also researchers. So in that sense, they will definitely understand the tug of war there, that, collecting data for research is hard and annoying and not immediately useful, but they see the value in it. So I guess that's another another thing we're going to have to balance there, how much we want to just make their lives easier versus get good data sets that can hopefully be used even internationally as a source of data on African populations, which is just hard to come by. So I guess in that space, you know, is there anything that sort of stands out in terms of when people try to do research with all of this, what are the things that are different versus just trying to do practical things with it?
Yeah, I mean, research encompasses a broad area, right? So there's one kind of research which I might think of as kind of the low-hanging fruit here, which is clinical IT research. And so this is something that we see quite often, where a new tool has been deployed in a clinical environment. Maybe a health system is working with CDS hooks, and they've deployed a CDS hook, and they have a notice in the EHR that less clinicians know that it's available. You know, that's that kind of setup, and they will make sure that they instrument the system to, first of all, detect changes. So they'll either say at some randomized level, we're going to have a population of clinicians for whom we make this available and a control population for whom we don't. Or they'll do a time-based switch over and say, you know, before this date it wasn't available, after this date it was. So they'll build some of that into their deployment plan, and then they'll track as much as they can about, you know, roughly speaking, stuff in the analytics world you'll be more familiar with than I am, but impressions and clicks, to be able to say, great. So after we started this intervention, you know, clinicians were exposed to this option to run this decision support service X number of times. They chose it a certain percentage of the time. Or, you know, when the alert fired, here's what they did. You know, they ignored it or they took an action. And sometimes those attributions can be really hard, particularly in the decision support world, if the decision support guidance is kind of open-ended. You might say, well, consider switching to this drug or something else in this class. And something that can happen is the clinician dismisses that warning, but then goes and does it. Or does something that's morally equivalent, or changes their course of action, you know, influenced by it. And so designing your IT deployment to be able to detect things like that later on can be quite challenging, right? It's not just, I dismissed the warning or I accepted the suggestion. It's, we need to build in some instrumentation downstream to measure what actually happened in terms of the order that was completed, even if they didn't go through my channel. So building in those kinds of integrations can help answer a lot of what I'll call clinical IT research questions. Could you get adoption? Was there any impact on the next steps that a clinician took? Did users like what they saw? What was the quality of the data? How often were things coded? And all those are, you know, IT research questions. And I think this is maybe not what you're getting at, but it's worth calling out because it is a discipline unto itself. And you know, there's certainly journals and academic research teams that focus in those areas. And then we get on to sort of maybe the interesting stuff, which is there a clinical impact? Are we making a difference in care, in health, and outcomes that people care about? And obviously the timescales are much longer, and attributing changes is much harder. I mean, particularly attributing changes in health outcomes to technology interventions is just a very slow and challenging game. I wouldn't expect to be able to do it early on. But, you know, you can think about, you know, the area of clinical tools that make studies easier to run, right? So if you're trying to ask a research question and part of what you need is collecting a certain set of data in the hospital, or sending a patient home and following up with them through text messages or some other channel over time, you know, that's a place where the technical infrastructure can just make it much easier to collate the data. Make it easier to sort of meet people where they are in the community with the tools that they prefer, and just kind of lower the friction of asking research questions. So that's a very natural place to engage, and people see the value proposition of that very quickly. Maybe the only other kind of top level point here, or maybe sort of anecdote from my experience, has been when you depend on structured data from a source that you don't control, it's universally a mess. And, you know, you need to think very early and carefully about, you know, kind of the mitigation strategies there. And, you know, there's a whole dark art of data scrubbing and heuristics and cleanup, which is necessary. But the other thing in terms of improving data quality is surfacing the data so that it's used in some clinical way. So like at Boston Children's Hospital, when we deployed an app for pediatric blood pressure management, there was nothing like showing the clinician a chart of blood pressures ranked by percentile, so they could understand kind of whether they were high or low based on the kid's age. And then they would notice there was like a window of time where there were no measurements. And the clinician would say, well, but I saw this patient during that window of time. I took their blood pressure. Where's my data? And okay, great. Now that starts a very specific chain of questions. And we can trace that back and say, oh, well, it turns out during this 4-month period, the hospital was transitioning the blood pressure codes that it used in the EHR. And so the codes that the app knew to query for were out of alignment with what the hospital was using, and that led to a gap in the data set. And if you don't surface that data set to a human being as part of a workflow they care about, you'll just never notice that problem. But as soon as you do, as soon as the data are being used, people will, and providing some value, then people will latch on and say, okay, here's how to improve it. Here's what's missing. Here's what I was expecting. They'll call out the problems. And so, that's maybe like, it's a sort of obvious lesson, but it's one that after I went through that loop, I developed a new appreciation for.
Yeah, I think, Josh, just on that note, it's what we call closed loop data capture, where, and the truth is, it doesn't matter how motivated someone is, how smart they are, how educated they are, unless you have a closed loop data capture system, data being captured without sufficient context on its implications will always be suboptimal, right?
Yes,
and that's why.
Sorry, go ahead.
Also, like within like potentially gamifying this, when I say gamifying, like have a report at the end of the week with how many patients you saw and some interesting stats, so that it's interesting and useful to look at. But if the stats are wrong, you can say, hang on a sec, it closes the loop around what you've just highlighted, right?
Yeah, right. And I think that, the trick is keeping those things kind of as pure and clinically interesting as possible, right? Like there's a lot of dystopian left turns you can take here around productivity, output, billing, and these are all like places that, the areas where in the US context at least, these kinds of systems will gravitate towards if you're not quite careful. And I'll say that around closed loop systems, often the way that we close the loop in the US is around administration and billing. And like for sure, people are going to detect if the billing codes are missing. And yeah, there's some value there when it comes to revenue for the clinical or provider organization, but it's a distinct sort of loop closing, and you optimize for different attributes of the data set.
Yeah, and that's to some extent an advantage in our world, because in private healthcare we see that everything's optimized to get the billing right, but not the clinical stuff right necessarily. But in our world, the billing's not the center of attention at all, because it's public healthcare, and we can focus on closing the loop on the clinical side without undue resources being consumed by the billing side, right?
Yeah. No, I think that's exactly right. And I'll say, just even from the consumer world, looking at something like an end of month report that I'll get from sharing my location with Google, which is a proposition that scares me a little bit, but I do it, and I do enjoy at the end of the month, a list of here's all the places you went, here's the trips you took, here's the new areas that you hadn't been to before, here's places you went back to. Just even a relatively straightforward kind of overview can provide people something interesting to reflect on.
Perhaps, Andreas, I don't know if you've got anything else.
I think for now this has been extremely useful. I don't have any more immediate questions. I think it's affirmed that we're on the right track. I think you've given us some guidance around the profile creation, the SDKs, etc. Some very practical stuff there, and yeah, this has been super useful actually.